critical review of Australian football diplomacy. I need to really practice on my pronunciation. So anyway, hand over to you, Gavin.
No worries. Thanks for having me, and Bore da from Wales. I'm Gavin Price. I'm a PhD student at Bond University in Australia, and I'm writing on sports diplomacy as it relates to small nations. But today I'm going to build upon research from my Masters in Global Diplomacy submitted to SOAS University of London in 2016. So that is a critical review of Australian football diplomacy in the Asia-Pacific region since the Football Federation's admission into the Asian Football Confederation in 2005. Just on that slide before I move on, you'll see the crests of some of the main actors in this presentation. So FFA, Football Federation Australia, AFC, Asian Football Confederation, and DFAT, which is the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in the Australian government. In terms of the running order, firstly, I'm going to look at this construct of sports diplomacy and football diplomacy and what we mean by that. Then I'll offer some brief context on Australian football. And then we'll talk about Australia's Confucian geographic and cultural history. Is it Asian? Is it a Western nation? And how do others see it? Then we'll move on to the key question to consider Australia, the period following Australia's transition to the Asian Football Confederation in 2005. Specifically, did its hosting of the 2015 AFC Cup? Did Australia maximise the potential benefits from football diplomacy during this period and as a result of this event? I'll then fast forward quickly to 2018 when the Australian government announced its diplomatic pivot towards the Pacific region and consider what that means for football diplomacy today. I'll then draw the conclusion that principally Australia is leading the way with some excellent sports diplomacy activity, but will propose that it can do much better in terms of measuring outcomes. And I'll also flag a few potential opportunities for football diplomacy moving forward. So,
sorry,
football.
I'll just butt in just before you get going.
Yeah.
All your notes are coming up on the screen. Is there any way to get the screen?
Sorry.
No, not a problem. Sorry, I didn't want to.
Yeah. Let's try that. Is that any better?
That's brilliant. Nice one. Fantastic.
Okay, sorry about that, guys.
No. Sorry, I didn't mean to butt in.
No, that's good. So, sports diplomacy, it's a confusing construct, but in simple terms, it's about sport and politics do mix for good and bad reasons, and sports diplomacy is the study of that mixing. But in short, it's the strategic use of and partnership with sporting events and sports people to build relations with people, nations, states, conducive to win-win outcomes. It covers many, many areas. There's some examples there: trade, tourism, hosting mega events, nation branding, and so on. So some positive examples might be the soft power and nation branding gains that you saw at the London 2012 Olympics or the Sydney 2000 Olympics for the UK and Australia. Some negative examples might be the bidding scandals that led to Russia and Qatar being awarded the World Cups, or the human rights scandals connected to the Brazil World Cup. But if you prefer a more fancy academic example, I might point you to Dr. Stuart Murray. He's one of the leading theorist practitioners in sports diplomacy. I won't read out that quote because it's quite long. You can read it yourself, but it basically says the same thing as my simple definition. What I will say is there are a bunch of other, there's a growing number of important experts in the field. I think Simon Rofe is online today, but there's a list of them there, and there are others. But what I would strongly argue is that sports diplomacy has now moved on from being seen as a substream of public diplomacy and sports diplomacy, and it probably warrants a singular focus in its own right. More specifically, football diplomacy. Now that's a subgenre of sports diplomacy, but as the Vulture, Emilio Buccigrino notes, it's about uniting people, and the objective of diplomacy is the same thing. It's about building bridges. We're talking about two very similar activities, and there you see Emilio working in a cultural relations capacity for Real Madrid, in Guatemala, on a social responsibility project. So Australia, just a bit of context on football in Australia. So according to Sport Australia in 2019, there are around 2 million people playing football. So that's by far the largest participation sport in the country. So on that measure, you could say it's the national game. Obviously, that's a bit contentious for Australian rules fans, National Rugby League. basketball, netball, cricket, and so on. But you could argue it is the national game. And it's also the only major football code in Australia with a truly global footprint. Australian rules is a niche game in Asia Pacific. Rugby league is really only played in Australia, New Zealand, the Pacific, Northern England, and a few other exceptions. Australia also has a really rich multicultural history beyond the flagship A-League. Many clubs are historic and they stem from post-World War II migration. So we're talking of teams like Marconi Stallions with Italian heritage. We're talking about Melbourne Knights with the Croatian heritage, and so on. These communities have been responsible for helping Australia in a footballing capacity along the way. So if you think of some of its major stars like Mark Viduka of Croatian Australian heritage, or John Aloisi of a Australian Italian background, they've been pivotal in helping move the game forward along with those migrant communities. As I mentioned earlier, Australia's geographical and cultural position in the world can be confusing for some. Is it Asian? Is it Western? In fact, is it actually Eurasian? In the last few decades, you've seen migration significantly from Asian countries such as Vietnam, China, and India to overlay the European migration, and obviously you have First Nation Australians within that. So I think Thacker's quote is really, really interesting. He says that its cultural identity is transatlantic, but it's located geographically in Asia Pacific. Its chief security guarantor is the US, but its biggest trading partner is China. The process of reconciling these twin tensions can be emotionally and intellectually wrenching. Now, this is interesting because in 2012, the then Gillard government published the Australia and the Asian Century white paper, and it offered a strategic framework for Australia's navigation of the Asian century. What was interesting about that from a footballing perspective was that the hosting of the Asian Cup and Australia's accession to the FFA were flagged as a way of fostering a deeper understanding of Asia and a deeper Asian understanding of Australia. Now, it's worth noting within that, there was a lot of opposition in Australia moving from the Oceania Federation to the Asian Federation, principally from Middle Eastern countries. I think there was a sense that Australia may dominate the region, and that's kind of played out in a way if you think Australia has qualified for World Cups at the expense of some teams in the AFC region. Having said all that, hosting the Asian Cup in 2015 was a huge success. Australia became intercontinental champions. It was possibly, well, it was widely seen as the most successful tournament to date in the AFC Confederation. Healthy gate receipts, healthy media coverage, and there were some soft pair success stories. If you think of the Iran-Iraq game, it ended 3-3 in Canberra. There was an amazing penalty shootout, but you had two geopolitical rivals pairing off, but the atmosphere was really positive. The migrant communities got into it. There was no problems, there was no trouble. It was a happy occasion. There was very, very little political posturing around the game. So how did Australia capitalise on this diplomatically? Well, on the lead up to the tournament, they came up with this idea called Match Australia through Austrade, the International Trade Agency. Match Australia is an international sports business and network programme established by the Australian government to connect Australian businesses with global partners via sport. That slide is really hard to read at a glance, but you can get the picture that there are a number of events around the AFC region. So we're talking business networking receptions, cultural and educational visits from players, consular visits, basically to use sport as a vehicle to promote Australia. In addition to that, it also ran cultural events at home. So there was a community AFC Cup ran in parallel with community migrant communities featuring as teams within the Cup. They also produced infographics between Australia and some of its key trading partners to demonstrate the ties that could be leveraged from the tournament potentially. Now, this is all fantastic stuff, but where were the quantitative and qualitative performance indicators to show the diplomatic bang for buck? So if we fast forward now to 2018, Australia's diplomatic focus changed. It moved towards the Pacific step-up. Basically, they were concerned about Chinese influence in the Pacific from a security and influence perspective. The junior women's team, the Matildas, toured Tonga, Vanuatu, the Solomon Islands, and New Caledonia. Now, within that, what they did, they again did a number of social responsibility visits. The Matildas trained with the national teams from Tonga, Vanuatu, and so on. There were cultural visits. They did measure social media analytics, but again, there were no major quantitative indicators, or at least they're not publicly or outwardly published. So you can see there Ashley Sykes. She was an ex-Matilda. She's training. I think it's the Fiji possible team, but I might have that wrong. But basically, it was about using an ex-player to build cultural relations ties, and hopefully that seed is planted, and people see Australia in a much more better light moving forward. So, just to conclude, because time is limited, Australia has definitely been leading the pack with its sports diplomacy. It's probably up there with France and the United States, but it definitely needs to work more closely with the sports ecosystem to develop more concrete football diplomacy and sports diplomacy success indicators. Having said all that, I do feel that the rise of the pro women's game in Australia is a really good opportunity for Australia. The Matildas are highly ranked. They have a top player in Chelsea's Sam Kerr. She's just been nominated for a Ballon d'Or for the second time. And they have a strong bid for the Women's World Cup with New Zealand. I think that's a really strong chance of getting up. In addition to that, Australia has been invited to take part in the Copa America in 2020. So all these are useful hooks for Australia to partner with different nations around Asia Pacific, and also with CONMEBOL nations in South America. In addition, I do think there's a huge opportunity for football diplomacy with First Nation Australians and migrant communities. Could we use football more for social inclusion in Australia? But just to finish, obviously there is the headwind of COVID-19. Now, the ramifications are huge, and there are many, but a major one for Australia is the major Foxtel, the major broadcaster of the A-League and the Asian Champions League in Australia, is really struggling and will probably pull out. The competition's viability will be put at risk. Also, we're battling against a really crowded global calendar. If you think things like like Euro 2020 will be postponed until next year, and we have all the European football leagues that need to be finalised this year. There's a lot of people vying for soft power, for prestige. We were talking earlier about, has Germany got a bit of a mark on the English Premier League and so on. So I'll just leave it at that and invite questions.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Gavin. That was really fascinating, especially mixing